Hey everybody, welcome to Tuesday Talks with Craig. It is March the 16th. It's Tuesday, it is 12 o'clock here in Okotoks, and it's time for Tuesday Talks. So glad you're joining me today. If you're not here live, glad you're joining me at some point, either today, later today or this week. And thanks for tuning in. The last few weeks, we've been going through a passage in Luke chapter 4, and I kind of chose this passage to help us walk through the Tuesdays of Lent. Lent is the 40 days leading up to Easter. It's typically a time of preparation. Often people give something up during Lent or give things up during Lent, maybe to focus more on their relationship with God or just to promote more of a healthy lifestyle. There's different reasons why people would give things up for Lent. But from a Christian perspective, in the Christian calendar, the season of Lent is to help us prepare. And often in Lent, we identify with Jesus' suffering that he would endure. And one of the passages that sort of highlights Jesus' suffering before the actual cross is in Luke chapter 4. So we've been looking at Luke chapter 4, and it starts out by saying, Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. And he would spend 40 days in the wilderness, and then the devil would come and tempt him and test him. And it was a time of fasting. So really it was a time where there was a degree of suffering going on. And as we've been going through this passage, we can maybe relate to the past year, this reality of living in a pandemic, living in this COVID reality, a life of lockdowns and restrictions and different things that have been sort of thrust upon us or that we've been thrust into in this world of COVID. So as you think about the wilderness and Jesus spending time in the wilderness, you might be able to say, you know what, I feel like I've been in the wilderness for the past 12 months. I know that's been sort of my posture with Lent. I didn't give up anything specific because I feel like in some ways COVID's taken enough away from me already. And so what I've tried to do is purposefully go through Lent and sort of ask the question, what am I supposed to learn through this wilderness experience? And I think as we're going through Jesus and these different temptations that he faces, we can be asking these kinds of questions. What is this wilderness experience of COVID exposing in us? Or how are we being tempted? Or how is our faith being tested? So with all of that as a bit of a recap, let's just jump into temptation number 3 from Luke chapter 4, and it begins in verse 9. So the devil led Jesus, to Jerusalem, and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. And the devil said to Jesus, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here, for it is written," and then the devil quotes from the Psalms, "He will command his angels concerning you to guard you carefully. They will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." And Jesus answered, "It is said, do not put the Lord your God to the test." So what's going on here? The devil takes Jesus up to the highest point of the temple in Jerusalem, sort of a place of God's presence and God's refuge, sort of symbolically, Jesus is standing on top of the temple, looking out over Jerusalem, and the temptation, the devil sort of tempts Jesus. He says, take a leap of faith, jump off of the temple, because surely God will rescue you. He will save you. He will send his angels to attend to you, and that your life will be spared. If you take a leap of faith, God will spare you. It sounds spiritual. It sounds good. But Jesus' response is, do not put the Lord your God to the test. So here's a little Bible study note. If you've got a Bible with footnotes in it, this is where my mind went. Okay, Jesus is quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 6 because I've got a little footnote in verse 12. And so I'm going to follow a little bit of a rabbit trail here. What is Jesus saying? He says, do not put the Lord your God to the test. So if we turn to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16, this is Moses speaking, says, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test as you did at Massah." So this is God trying to speak to his people through Moses. Do not put the Lord your God to the test as you did at Massah. So then again, my mind goes, well, what happened at Massah? And again, there's a footnote that takes me to Exodus chapter 17. Listen to what happens here. This is right after God led the Israelites, Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. And it says, the whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water, and they grumbled against Moses, and they said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" And so the test that's going on with the Israelites is they're questioning God's purposes. Why did you lead us out of Egypt? We're thirsty. At another point, they talk about being hungry, and they're complaining. And they're kind of wanting to go back. Life was better in Egypt. Why did you lead us out of there? And so they're questioning God's plans and purposes. Really, it's a matter of trust. They're not fully trusting God. They're not trusting God's purposes for them as a people. And so if we fast forward back to Jesus in the wilderness with the devil, and Jesus says, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test," there's a couple things that come to mind here. One is the issue of trust. The devil is trying to tempt Jesus to question God's plans and purposes for him. And the test here is Jesus is saying, am I going to be obedient to God and the mission that he's called me to? Or am I going to put God to the test and sort of take fate or destiny into my own hands? Am I willing to throw myself off of the temple, take this leap of faith that the devil is tempting me to take, and sort of take matters into my own hands? Or am I willing to trust God and his plans and purposes for me, which might have to do with this season of suffering? Another word that comes to mind here is the issue of control. Do we want to control our own circumstances? The Israelites, back in Exodus, in that episode there, the Israelites were really wanting to take matters into their own hands. Let's go back to Egypt. Life was better there. We can eat and drink. Our thirst will be quenched if we go back there. We can, control our own destiny. So trust and control are sort of two words, I think, kind of at the heart of this temptation. And so as we look at Jesus, his response, the devil was tempting him to take this leap of faith to control his own destiny, and Jesus didn't do it. He didn't jump off the temple. Jesus didn't put his faith, or didn't put God to the test. But Jesus took a different kind of leap of faith. And the leap of faith that Jesus took in this event is that he chose to trust God through radical obedience to God's plans and purposes. Jesus was willing to surrender to the mission that God had in mind for him, a mission that would ultimately lead him to a cross, a mission that prior to being arrested and taken to the cross, Jesus would be in serious prayer, wrestling with God, saying, if it's possible, take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours be done. I think this temptation really gets at the heart of the issue of who are we really living for? Where are we placing our trust? Are we trying to take control of our life and our destiny, or are we willing to surrender to God and his plans and purposes for us? So to kind of wrap this up, just by way of application, what can we glean from this? What can we learn from this passage? Maybe a couple questions. And one question would be, how has the wilderness experience of COVID exposed your desire to be in control? How has this wilderness experience of COVID exposed your desire to be in control? We've had lockdowns and restrictions and requests and mandates being made on us, to sort of live a certain way, to isolate, to wash our hands, to use hand sanitizer, to put on masks, to limit our gatherings, all these things that we're being asked to do or told to do. They kind of, might get to the issue of control. We don't like being told what to do. And some of us resist that. We want to take matters into our own hands. We want to live life on our terms. And in our relationship with God, I think that reality that we might be wrestling with in the COVID reality is also a spiritual reality to consider. In our walk with God, are we willing to surrender control and give up our rights to Him, to let Him lead us and guide us into His plans and purposes for us? So how has control, or the issue of control, been exposed in your life through COVID? And how might you consider that in light of your walk with God? Are you willing to surrender to Him? Another one is this issue of trust. Have you questioned your trust in God, or has your trust in God been put to the test through this season of COVID, through this year of COVID? Are you doubting God in any way, shape, or form? The Israelites back in Exodus, they were questioning God. We're thirsty. God, where are you? Why did you lead us out of here? And I'm not saying that God has led us into COVID, but we are where we are. And the question might be, God, where are you in this? And maybe you're doubting Him. Maybe you're wondering what He's up to. Maybe you're wondering where He is, or whether or not He's even with you in the midst of all of this. And I think this temptation that Jesus wrestles with here, temptation number 3, invites us to renew our trust in God, to believe that God is who He says He is, that He hasn't abandoned us, that He hasn't given up on us, that He still loves us, that He's still the all-powerful one, the almighty one, and our trust can remain in Him even in the midst of a season of suffering. Just like Jesus was suffering and being tempted in the wilderness, His trust in God was still strong. How's your trust in God today? So trust and control. Another question, how might you surrender to God's plans and purposes these days? What are God's plans and purposes for you, and how might you surrender to them? Jesus prayed, not my will, but yours be done. How might that be your prayer today? And to really just wrap this all up, where my mind goes with this, the question for me is, as I think about surrendering to God's plans and purposes, 2 things come to mind, the 2 greatest commandments that Jesus reminded us of: to love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. If God's plan and purpose for me is to love Him fully and to love my neighbor as I love myself, how am I willing to surrender to those plans? How am I doing at loving God these days? How's my relationship with Him? How am I doing at loving the people that God has placed in my life, even in the midst of COVID? Am I willing to surrender to His purpose to love the people around me? So trust and control, radical obedience to God, surrender to His plans and purposes, loving God completely, loving your neighbor as yourself. These are all things that we could be considering as we look at this last temptation from this wilderness scene that Jesus found Himself in. Next week, we'll kind of wrap it all up and with a couple more thoughts, but that's it for today. Thanks for joining me. I'm praying for you through this season of Lent, that this really is a time of renewal in your walk with God, and that as we've been going through these different temptations, that hopefully you've got some things to think about and consider, and invite Jesus into those places in your life. So thanks again for joining me. We'll see you next Tuesday for another talk. Have a good day and a good week.